Welcome to the Weekend Hour with Pat Williams on News 96.5. Now here's your host, Pat Williams.
Welcome once again, folks, to the Pat Williams Weekend Hour. We do this show every weekend on News 96.5 in Orlando, and always look forward to you visiting with us. Laurel Lee, better known as Lovely Laurel Lee, does the engineering for us each week. Andrew Herdliska is our producer. And Michael Rinella is with us. He's in Albany, New York. He's our guest in this first half hour. Editor of Lee Harvey Oswald, As I Knew Him. Michael, welcome. I'm glad we can visit. How you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
So tell me about George de Mohrenschildt.
Yes.
Who was he, and where does this all fit, please?
Well, George de Mohrenschildt was an emigre from the old Russia. He left Europe in the 1930s, came to America, tried his hand at several occupations, got a degree in petroleum geology in Texas, and joined essentially the Texas oil elite while living in Texas and going through a couple of marriages and never quite, he struck it rich, but he was a very well-connected man. And then in the summer of 1962, he, through the Russian emigre community in Dallas, was introduced to one Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina.
And what happened after that? What was the next step?
Well, he had a lot of contact with Oswald in the fall of 1962. A lot of the members of the Russian emigre community were trying to assist them to get on their feet, helping Lee search for a job. And then as time went by, they were basically all conspiring with each other to get Marina and Lee divorced because there was, obviously domestic abuse going on. And the de Mohrenschildts were part of that group, basically trying to create a separation, a temporary separation to see if they wanted to divorce each other or not. That's really what was going on in the fall of 1962. And after Marina initially left Lee but then went back, virtually all the Russians abandoned them except for George de Mohrenschildt and his wife, who did keep some sporadic contact with them into the spring of 1963. Then, of course, they left the country to go live in Haiti in June of 1963, so they weren't in the United States for the next, 2.5 years after that.
The preface to this book, Michael, is called I'm Just a Patsy. What's that mean?
Well, the original name of de Mohrenschildt's manuscript, which was, of course, just an appendix on a government document published in 1979, was titled I'm a Patsy, which de Mohrenschildt incorrectly claimed were Lee Harvey Oswald's last words. It's just something he said to a television camera during the first night he was in custody. As I actually found out since the publication of the book, de Mohrenschildt's manuscript was actually named The Harvey Lee Oswald That I Knew right up until 1976, and then he changed it to this I'm a Patsy title. But it's interesting that I changed the title of the book almost to exactly what it originally was titled in the beginning.
The first chapter of this book is called First Conversations with Lee.
Yes.
What's going on here?
Well, basically, we're not quite sure how or why it happened, but de Mohrenschildt was told that Lee had lived in the city of Minsk in the Soviet Union, and de Mohrenschildt had spent a portion of his childhood in the city of Minsk, so he was interested to learn, how the city had changed, what was life like there, and so on. And so in these first conversations, he and Lee are mainly talking about Lee's time in the Soviet Union. He learns about Marina's background and, where she grew up and what her life was like. She was evidently trained to be a pharmacist. And a few other basic things in that first chapter really covers that ground.
Second topic, Lee's troubled marriage to Marina.
Yes. Well, that was a very troubled marriage, without a doubt. Lee, from all the from the book and from everything else I've read, he was just a very fanatically controlling kind of husband. Did not want his wife seeing anyone doing anything without his, knowledge and permission. He refused to let her learn English, although everyone else was telling her, you've got to learn English. You're in America now. How can you function without being able to speak the language? But Lee kept saying, no, I don't want her to learn English because then I'll, start to lose my Russian language skills. So that was one of the problems within their marriage, which is, controlling nature, this issue over learning the language, and there was domestic abuse. And from everything I've learned while, researching the book, it wasn't completely one way. Marina had a very acidic tongue and berated her husband, berated his performance in the bedroom, everything. It was definitely what you could call a troubled marriage. What's become of Marina, by the way? The summary of Marina? No, what has become of Marina? Oh, Marina. She remarried in, I think, 1965 or 1966, and has, although she separated, I think, in the 70s, she still sort of has a non-married relationship with that man. She still lives in Texas, still lives near Dallas, as far as I know. And how old would she be now? She would probably be in her early to mid-70s. I think she was born in 1941. Yeah, that would make her 74. Yeah. Now I want you to talk about the third area of this book, Final Conversations with Lee. Yes. Well, this chapter really is more about the early 1963 period. It talks about the famous home movie of the de Mohrenschildts, because when George de Mohrenschildt's son died of cystic fibrosis in 1960, he basically almost had a nervous breakdown, and to recover from that, he and his wife essentially hiked across the length of Central America. Now, imagine doing this in 1960. You're from a conservative city like Dallas, and you're like, oh, excuse us, we're leaving for about 10 or 12 months to walk across Central America. And while he was on that walk, he filmed it. He made an enormous home movie of it. And it basically would show that at every opportunity. And in this chapter, one of the final conversations with Lee was one of these home movie showings where the discussion, centered around Latin America, Castro, communism, things like that. And evidently it was a very animated conversation because most of de Mohrenschildt's friends were, really Russian emigres, conservative, people from the oil industry who were very conservative. So it was quite the animated conversation from all accounts. Now we get to Haiti and the Warren Commission, Michael. Yes. Well, George de Mohrenschildt had always been looking for that big score, the big coup that would make his life's fortune. And he signed a contract with the government of Haiti to basically do a geological survey of the entire country. Haiti in the early 1960s was, by some accounts, basically your prototypical Caribbean, right-wing dictatorship. The regime was just psychotic on many levels. And he was a very trusting man, and he thought his contract would be honored. So he's down there in Haiti, interacting with a whole host of characters, CIA people, the Haitians. And while that is all going on, of course, President Kennedy gets assassinated. And de Mohrenschildt was actually at a party at an embassy while that happened. And when he heard that Kennedy had been assassinated, the first thing that came out of his mouth was, I wonder if it could have been Lee, which kind of immediately put the spotlight on de Mohrenschildt and his wife, but they weren't hiding anything. They went right to the embassy, and they did 2 interviews at the American embassy saying, yes, we did know the Oswalds. They were a rather strange couple, and at the time, at least, he was quite willing to, as I say in the book, to throw Lee Harvey Oswald under the bus and just say, the guy was a little nutty, and we were over at his house one time and we saw a rifle in his closet. You can draw your own conclusions, and so eventually, they get flown to Washington. They testify before the Warren Committee. His testimony and his wife's testimony are among the longest in the entire multi-volume collection of the Warren Commission and exhibits report. I think only Marina and Oswald's mother's testimony are longer than the de Mohrenschildt. It's about 180, 90, 200 pages long. Now you write about a ghost visits finding a photograph. Yes. Well, this is again one of these interesting stories about de Mohrenschildt in his book claims that a couple months after they returned from Haiti, they went to a warehouse where a lot of his possessions were stored, and they found a box with some language records which they had lent to the Oswalds, and they couldn't figure out how the box had gotten back in there. And then they were looking in the actual record sleeves, and out supposedly slips his photo of Lee Harvey Oswald, the famous one that was on the cover of Life magazine, holding the rifle with the pistol at his side and the two Communist Party newspapers. And on the back, it says, to my friend George from Lee, in Oswald's handwriting, and then there's in Russian handwriting, it says, this is the hunter of fascists, ha, 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 which many people believe is Marina's handwriting. Now, this photo quite possibly was really in the de Mohrenschildt's possession before they left it for Haiti, and they just didn't want anyone to know that, and they were worried that they were going to be brought up on charges of concealing evidence. So it's unclear whether the photo was in their possession before they left for Haiti or after they came back from Haiti, like they said. So that chapter really deals with this story of finding the photo. They try to, get Life magazine and Look magazine interested in publishing it to make a little money because they were nearly broke. But nobody's really, they're like, well, it's a photo, it's nice, and the inscription's nice, but, unless you got a little more for us, we really don't have enough to publish here. So they never ended up making any money off the photo.
Michael Rinella is with us from Albany, New York. He is the editor and annotator of Lee Harvey Oswald as I knew him, and we're learning a great deal about George de Mohrenschildt. And now we get to the sixth area, Michael. Who were the real criminals? ? The
book was really written by the end of 1969. Most of the book is based on some studio tapes that de Mohrenschildt and a Dutch journalist named Willem Oltmans made in Dallas, and he basically just transcribed these audio tapes for most of the book. But then this final chapter, was written in the mid-70s, or 75, 76, and it contains speculations about what really happened in Dallas. By this point, de Mohrenschildt is sort of flip-flopped. He becomes more and more convinced that Lee was innocent, or that he was just a very small pawn in some much larger, power struggle that was going on. And for the final years of his life, he was really convinced that it was basically right-wing Cubans who had participated in the Bay of Pigs. Most of them were either killed, a large number of them were captured and then repatriated to the U.S. in exchange for some food aid in December 1962. And de Mohrenschildt felt that, well, you've got a whole group of people that are angry about, Kennedy withdrawing the air cover at the Bay of Pigs. Any one of them could have been the killers. So basically in this final chapter, he sort of comes down on the side of it was probably some kind of, group of Cubans, and but we'll never know until somebody actually comes forth and, confesses to doing it. He's sort of cynical about it ever really being solved, but at the same time says, well, these are my opinions. I think it was the right-wing anti-Castro Cubans that were behind it. He does mention Jim Garrison a couple of times, especially in this last chapter. Mainly in sort of a negative light. That Garrison had tried to uncover the truth, but had been crushed by the powers that be, who had their own agenda, and that's sort of where the book ends. It ends on a kind of a positive note. He says, there was, Oswald was an idealist who was searching for a utopia that he could never find, and that he was a halfway decent friend, and he died much too young, and that's sort of how the book ends.
My guest is Michael Rinella, and he's joining us from Albany, New York. Fascinating discussion here about this book. University of Kansas Press put it out. Lee Harvey Oswald as I knew him. George de Mohrenschildt was the author, and now Michael Rinella has plowed into it, has become the editor and the annotator, and he is our guest. We have another segment with Michael, and so I want you to stay with us. We still have some more uncovering to do on this intriguing story. You're listening to the Pat Williams Weekend Hour, News 96.5 in Orlando. We do it every
You're listening to the Weekend Hour on News 96.5. Now here's your host, Pat Williams.
Michael Rinella is with us, the editor of this book, Lee Harvey Oswald, As I Knew Him. Big question, Michael. What became of George de Mohrenschildt? What was the outcome of his life?
Well, this sort of circles back to, how did I become interested in this book manuscript and George de Mohrenschildt in the first place? I was, there were many mysterious deaths connected to the Kennedy assassination, or allegedly connected to the Kennedy assassination, and George de Mohrenschildt's death was near the top of the list. And a few months before he supposedly killed himself with a shotgun, he wrote a letter to then Director of Central Intelligence, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was a friend of his through his brother Dmitri as far back as the late 40s. And this letter has often been quoted by Kennedy assassination researchers. It says, there's a net closing in around us. Can you help an old friend? I'll only ask you once. I won't bother you again. Your, good friend, George de Mohrenschildt. And of course, Bush wrote him a very, perfunctory, I'm sorry to hear you're feeling this way, but I can't really help you. The government really hasn't been interested in you for over 10 years, a very bureaucratic, there's nothing going on here kind of letter. But for me, George de Mohrenschildt and his death is really, if you know the man, he always had a persecution complex. I mean, even going back before the Kennedy assassination, you can see this in the testimony of his friends. He thought the John Birch Society and the FBI were, breaking into his home, looking at his, his other book manuscripts. This was before Kennedy was assassinated. And that kind of paranoia, persecution complex began to intensify in the early 70s, as I say in the book, and to the point where it became overwhelming. I even drop a hypothesis. It's not necessarily true. His good friend Sam Balin, said that the last time he had dinner with de Mohrenschildt, he felt like he was dining with Hemingway at the end. And if you know Hemingway's the final months of his life are distinctly parallel to George de Mohrenschildt. He thought the FBI was after him. He was institutionalized and given drug and shock therapy, just as de Mohrenschildt was. And then Hemingway killed himself with a shotgun. De Mohrenschildt killed himself with a shotgun. But it also turns out that Hemingway had a kind of rare blood disease that people of Scandinavian and Scottish background have, that basically leads to a mental deterioration. There's a fancy name for it, which I can't recall off the top of my head. I think that George de Mohrenschildt was developing symptoms of that same disease that Hemingway had in the last 6 months of his life, and he clearly, I think, he was a man that was absolutely crushed by death in his family. His first son died in 1960, and he had to take a walk across Central America to recover. And then when his daughter died of cystic fibrosis, the same disease, in 1973, he clearly went into another decline. And his letter to DCI Bush even mentions, I've been behaving like a damn fool since the death of my daughter 4 years ago. And, I mean, to me, that's the most important line in the entire letter to Director of Central Intelligence Bush, is that he knew something was wrong, but he didn't understand what was wrong. And he basically, he began to get in the clutches of the wrong people. And the assassination researchers began to hound him more and more. And, ultimately, I think he was just, he was pushed to the brink. I mean, on the last day of his life, he was doing interviews. He was given a newspaper clipping from the Dallas Papers, front page clipping that's, announced that he had been, institutionalized the fall of the previous year. And he asked the guy that was interviewing, do you think there's a warrant out for my arrest? And the guy said, I don't know, but I'll check. And so he went home, and then where he was staying, and his daughter said, "Oh, there's a researcher from the House Select Committee on Assassinations dropped by today and left his card. He wants to talk to you." Well, about 2 hours later, de Mohrenschildt killed himself. I mean, he just saw in his own mind, the world closing in around him, and maybe he was fearful that some of the smaller fibs he told the Warren Commission about not knowing much about Oswald's rifle and the photo were going to, come back to haunt him, and he was going to be prosecuted for it. I think they would have just given him immunity for his testimony, but he didn't know that. And coupled with his, persecution complex and paranoia, it just pushed him over the edge, and he killed himself.
Michael, thanks so much for joining us. What a wonderful half hour. Fascinating.
Thank you very much.
Michael Rinella has put together the Lee Harvey Oswald As I Knew Him book. We've got more after this on the Pat Williams Weekend Hour, News 96.5 in Orlando.